Good afternoon and welcome, dear viewers, to the EduSat live lecture for the science stream. Today we will be talking about polypeptides and protein sequencing. This is a lecture in the series where we are talking about introduction to proteins, and today we are looking at how to find the primary structure of the protein. So, beginning with the lecture, we have seen and studied in our previous lectures what are the components or what is the hierarchy of structure which is occurring at the proteins. So, we have seen there is a primary structure which is comprising of the amino acids which are covalently linked by the peptide bond, and here also you will encounter the disulfide bridges which occur within the chain or may occur interchain or intrachain. Then we have the secondary structure where you encountered the alpha helices and the types of other helices, the strands and turns and beta sheets. Again, more complex was the tertiary structure, which was the functional unit which gave the function to the protein, and here the secondary structure elements were oriented in a way so that held by weak interactions, and hydrophobicity was the major force here, and it gives rise to the functional protein. So, we will be looking at techniques to study all these structures, and today we are going to focus on how we can decipher the primary structure of the protein, namely the amino acid sequence. Why should we be interested in finding the amino acid sequence? We can approach this problem from various aspects. Firstly, maybe we have encountered a new protein and we want to know what is its protein's primary structure. Or maybe we are trying to find a protein's function by comparison with the database already existing. There can be other reasons for which we may be doing a protein sequencing, maybe to find the purity of the sample before we take it up for other techniques for structural determination. Or if we are designing certain molecules, we can require protein sequence knowledge for finding the exact binding or active site. So, why we need to have the primary protein sequence? We may have gene sequences for which we do not know if there is a protein which is actually present in the universe, in the living systems. So, we can compare if there is a probable protein for a particular gene, and vice versa. If there is a protein which is available to us and we have the primary sequence, we can work back to get the gene sequence. This way, lot of proteomic and genomic studies are conducted to know exact metabolic state or maybe the genomic and proteomic state of the cell under various conditions of stress, metabolism and such. We can also do de novo sequencing for those proteins for which there is no available sequence information. These proteins can be encountered when we are doing thorough metabolic studies and encounter proteins which are only expressed at certain metabolic states or under stress or other conditions. These de novo sequencing also helps to enrich the database, because now you have a system, a sequence which the information you can add on to the library or the database. We can find and study the evolutionary history of the protein. If we know the sequence, we can do a comparative study with the existing database and predict the history of evolution, how the protein has come into being under different organisms. And we can also correlate the function of the protein to its structure. So, if we have a primary sequence, we can search the entire database, compare it to a protein and maybe suggest a function to a novel protein. We can also suggest what is the location of this protein or where is it going to be localized in the cell, depending on the various target sequences that occur on the N-terminal or signaling sequence that occur on the N-terminal. If we are sequencing those, we can predict, is this protein destined to go to a particular organelle or where is going to be located for its future function. And compiling all this information, we can create bioinformatic databases, enrich them. Databases are nothing but all the information we get from experiments, and we deposit them in certain repositories. So, this way it enriches the database, and more number of molecules are added. Even when we add more molecules, it increases the efficiency of the database. So, the story of sequencing starts with Frederick Sanger's Nobel Prize in 1953, when he presented the sequence of bovine insulin in 1953, and the Nobel Prize came in 1958 for his work on the structure of proteins and that of insulin. Sanger continued to work, and he did sequencing of DNA as well, and it also brought him another Nobel Prize, which was in year 1980. But the story dates much back, and we here talk about Per Edman, who has been a person who started working on various chemicals or various dyes that could label the N terminal or some terminal of the protein for identification and further its for its identification. So, there are two researches which benefit from the work of Per Edman, and one is the Nobel Prize that went to Bruce Merrifield for peptide synthesis, and another definitely for Frederick Sanger, who later modified this technique, and it is known for its protein sequencing. So, Per Edman developed in principle the technique, and we will see what are the components of this technique. So, how do we proceed if we want to find the sequence of a protein? What is the way to go about it? So, the protein has to be obtained pure from its source, maybe from a recombinant cell or maybe from a tissue, and we will discuss in detail the techniques that are required for protein purification. So, once we have found the protein in its purified form, in homogeneous form and in intact form, we can proceed to do its sequencing. So, once we have obtained the protein, we have to now fragment it. The fragmentation is done using various enzymes and chemicals. We will discuss about it. We must cut or chop down the longer polypeptides into smaller manageable peptides, which further may be again cut down by enzymes. We have to take care of the disulfide bonds, remove any such disulfide bonds, and label it using the dyes etc., which Sanger's reagent or Edman's reagent or Dancel chloride. And once we have sequenced the fragments, we have to join back the puzzle pieces or reconstruct the overlapping regions to give you the sequence of the peptide and then of the protein to which the peptide belong. So, first thing is, what is hydrolysis of proteins to yield the peptides? Hydrolysis is a simple thing we do, is to break down the peptide bonds. Here peptide bonds, which are the amide bonds and are relatively strong, so you need different methods and precise methods to break this bond. We can hydrolyze these bonds with enzymes or with strong acids or strong bases or heat. Heat will take a longer time, very high heat will be required, and peptide and proteins are anyways hydrolyzed in our stomach with both acids and enzymes, and regularly we uptake the amino acids after the digestion of the protein. And here we can see an alanine serine peptide bond is broken to yield the respective amino acids. So, protein hydrolysis can be by enzymatic fragmentation, and we know certain digestive enzymes we can recall: trypsin, chymotrypsin, pepsin, elastase. So, they have a specificity to where they will cut and what residues will they attack. Here you can see trypsin is resulting in the digestion of a peptide fragment where lysine or arginine is present. So, it will cleave at the carboxy end of the positively charged amino acids arginine or lysine only if there is no proline after it. So, there is limited proteolysis in this case, as a protein may not have as many arginine and lysine residues, unless of course it is a very basic protein. So, we can see various fragments after trypsin cleavage. In the databases, you will find databases of trypsin cleavage of various proteins, and that can be used as a beginning step to understand the protein relationship or to correlate your protein with the database. So, which enzymes cut where and how can we use them? Mostly trypsin is used, considering if we use Edmonds reaction or if we use mass spectrometry, trypsin is the enzyme of choice because of its robustness. There are, however, other chemicals that can be used and we will list them. So, there is cyanogen bromide that will cut at the right of a methionine and it will form a cyclized product. Carboxypeptidase A will cut at the C terminal, but cleaves all such residues, but will not cut at arginine or lysine. Carboxypeptidase B will cleave only right of the arginine and lysine, and hence we call it as a exopeptidase. So, trypsin will cut at arginine and lysine anywhere where they exist in the protein. Chymotrypsin will attack the aromatic amino acid. Elastase will cut at the smaller ones, the alanine, glycine, valine, serine, etc. Thermolysin will cut around isoleucine, methionine, and proline. Wherever it occurs, it is not going to have any enzymatic cleavage because of its cyclized structure. So, once we are able to cut the protein and we have obtained the fragments, we have to determine the N and the C terminal, and this can be done by the end group analysis. So, we have to find how many chains if we look here, there can be several chains that can be formed and we have to identify which is the N group and which is the C group of these fragments. So, we can use different reagents to label the N terminal, and before proceeding for labeling, all these fragments have to be bound to a PVDF membrane or to a glass bead, or this is done by tethering them to this membrane and then labeling with the Sanger's reagent, which is 1-fluoro-2,4-dinitrobenzene, or Dancil chloride, or Edmonds reagent, which is phenyl isothiocyanate. There are some enzymes which can also do the C terminal labeling. So, once we are trying to identify the N terminal by labeling it, we can proceed to also identify the residue as what type of amino acid is that. So, the free unprotected alpha amino groups are labeled using reagents that will selectively bind only to the terminal amino acid, and these, once they are labeled, they can be hydrolyzed with strong acids such as hydrofluoric acid, which will yield the N terminal residue, and it will cause the remaining peptide to generate a new N terminal, which can be further labeled, and this cycle can go on. So, these N terminal labeled residues now can be taken, eluted, and can be identified using chromatography, and we will look at the scheme. So, these reagents, 3 of them have different advantages. We can see that Dancil chloride is 100 times more sensitive than FDNB, which is Sanger's reagent, due to its high fluorescence, and Edmonds reagents leaves the remaining residues in the peptide chain intact. So, we can use it constantly for finding each and every amino acid which is comprising the polypeptide chain, and they require 10 to 100 picomoles of samples, which can be even taken from a gel or size exclusion chromatography. We, however, require very pure and homogeneous samples, and polypeptide length is also important. So, we cannot go on and sequence an entire protein. We have to fragment it to smaller fragments of smaller polypeptides around 50 to 20 amino acid long for an efficient sequencing. Also, while we are preparing our samples, we have to take care that there are no interfering agents such as glycine, glycerol, glycine coming from tris kind of buffers, sucrose, guanidine, ethanolamine, ammonium sulfate and other ammonium salts. So, sample preparation and purity of the protein is of prime importance while conducting such experiments. So, once we have obtained the purified protein and have enzymatically chopped it up, we immobilize the peptides on a chemically modified glass bead or by electroblotting onto a polyvinylidene fluoride membrane. Now, under mildly alkaline conditions, the PITC then reacts with the uncharged terminal group on the amino acid chain to form a phenyl thiocarbamoyl derivative, and this derivative is then cleaved using a strong acid. These days we use trifluoroacetic acid, which will yield an anilothiazolone derivative, and this ATZ derivative amino acid has to be eluted and chromatography has to be performed, and then it is analyzed at the stage of chromatography. So, now once the ATZ amino acid is removed, the next terminal amino acid is now exposed and it becomes the new N terminal, and again here now PTIC can bind. A wash step is required to remove the excess buffer and reagent after each and every ATZ residue is removed. So, here once the ATZ amino acid is extracted with ethyl acetate and converted to a more stable phenyl thiohydantoin form, it can be further identified using chromatography or electrophoresis. This can go on, new N terminals can be generated, but this cannot be done more than 50 cycles. So, before we proceed for this kind of protein sequencing, we have to take care of the sample preparation as well. Here we have to obtain a peptide which is formed by which can be obtained by reacting the protein with a denaturing agent, with heat or with an acid, so that all non-covalent covalent interactions are removed and a primary structure is obtained. We can then use enzymes which can be in the ratio of 1:20. So, 1 molecule of enzyme to 20 of the protein, and can keep it for maybe overnight for digestion to occur, and this then further is treated with for the covalent interaction. So, once you have removed the non-covalent, now you focus on the covalent interactions. Most commonly covalent interaction that will be found in the protein will be from the disulfide bridges. The insulin structure per se, the first structure which was sequenced also has two disulfide bridges. So, how do you take care of them? So, the disulfide bond which is due to the cysteine, which could be intra-chain or interchain, these can be blocked by two methods. In the presence of DTT, which is a reducing agent, we can block the cysteine, and now it is SH group. Before that it was SS bond, now it has become a reduced SH group. This can be now fixed with a carboxymethylation by an iodoacetate, and this will form a stable, a little more stable group which is blocked, and it will not further form any disulfide bonds. Remember, these bonds are reversible, the reduction and oxidation step can occur and the bond can be formed again. Another method is by oxidation by performic acid, and this performic acid will again block the cysteine residues by forming the cystic acid. So, once you have taken care of the cysteine disulfide bonds and the covalent interactions are taken place, we can now proceed with our sequencing. So, now we can see a protein polypeptide would look as beautiful as a beads on a string, and once we are trying to find the sequence of the beads, we have to proceed at one end, and each of the bead we have to take out by we have to label then we have to take out by acid hydrolysis, and then we have to perform its chromatography. So, here we can see there is the free end of the bead of the beads on string, and as one is removed, the second one becomes the site for further reaction. So, there are sequencing methods which could be N-terminal or C-terminal or bioinformatic, and here we are going to use we are talking about 3 such reagents here, which can be selectively label the N-terminals. There are certain drawbacks also of this. So, we cannot exceed the chain length beyond 50 to 60 residues, because after that there exists a lag, the efficiency decreases, and best is to go with 30 residues. After that, because you will encounter incomplete cyclical derivatization. Also, the drawbacks of reagent based labeling and this process of sequencing is that Edman degradation will fail if you encounter post translational modifications, or if there are blocking of the protein by maybe acetyl formyl or pyroglutamyl groups, there is a glycosylation, acetylation and so forth. So, all these blockings will prevent the reaction with the with the phenyl isothiiodantoin. The disulfide bridges between 2 cysteines also can sequester the N-terminus and can sterically hinder the cyclization. Also, interfering agents may be added to prevent this kind of cyclization. And many a times a problem may be that a protein or peptide does not have a N-terminal. How can that be? Well, certain proteins such as a small cyclosporin, which is a cyclical molecule, does not have an N-terminal. So, what do you do in that case? Also, there is a question on the efficiency of sequencing. We are talking about chemistry, we are talking about a technique maybe 60 years back, and it definitely have some efficiency issues which are answered by new developing technologies. So, the efficiency of sequencing differs for the different amino acids. How does the labeling reagent reacts with a N-terminal amino acid may differ for a different amino acid depending on its steric or maybe depending on its reactivity. Overall efficiency is less than 100%, it is never 100%, usually it is around 96 to 95%. So, as and when more and more cycles are introduced, the yield of sequences will decline and more lag will occur and background noises will increase. So, number of cycles at which this will start occurring will be 50 or more, and this will depend to a great extent on the size and the type of amino acid content of the polypeptide itself. So, looking briefly at the mechanism of Edman's degradation, it is comprised of 3 steps: the coupling, cleavage and the conversion reaction. So, the coupling step shown here, in which PITC reacts with the amino group here. So, at the N terminals, and this is occurring under basic condition. So, Edman had used pyridine and pH obtained was 8.6. Now, these days methyl piperidine, methanol, water etc. are also used to create the basic conditions, and this will result in a phenyl thiocarbamyl derivative, which we are calling as the PTC polypeptide or PTC protein. So, it is bound to the N terminal. This, under conditions of acidic and anhydrous conditions, cleavage will occur with trifluoroacetic acid around 20%, and then it will cleave off the first amino acid along with it. So, the blue amino acid will be cleaved and it will remain with the PTC. Now, once this cleavage is occurred, this polypeptide generates a fresh N terminal which can be further labeled. So, what happens of this thiazolinone derivative? After this cleavage, the ATC amino acid is derivatized and it is cyclized and it is converted to another form, which is the phenyl thiohydantoin form. This derivative is more stable and this is extracted with ethyl acetate, and this can now be taken up for chromatography. So, there are other byproducts also which are formed and we are not looking at them right now. So, this is the scheme. We start with the protein, denature it, obtain the polypeptide, fragment it. Each fragment binding or coupling reaction occurs, coupling, and then cleavage will occur at low pH, and at low pH only the ATZ derivative becomes the phenyl thiohydantoin derivative, and this now further is taken up for chromatographic determination. So, this technique of degradation is coupled with a kind of HPLC or a liquid chromatography system, and these PTH amino acids are then transferred to a reverse phase C18 column for detection, and this can be read easily at 270 nanometers. Before we run our sample, we have to run a standard so that we know the retention times and elution volumes of the standard PTC amino acids. So, they are run usually before sequencing is started, and it is kept as a library, and the standard retention times of the amino acids are then used for comparison when each of these Edmond degradation PTC amino acids arrive at the column. HPLC chromatograms are then compared with the chromatogram for the standard, and this process is repeated sequentially to provide the N-terminal sequence of the protein and the polypeptide. So, up to 30 amino acid residues can be determined in an average run, and this may sound very tedious, very manual, but now automation has taken over. So, once we have obtained the peptides, which we believe we had fragmented and obtained the peptides fragments, and we have now the sequence of these fragments. So, we have to work back and fit in what is the sequence of the protein. So, these polypeptide chain, once you have determined the sequence of each of them, we can try doing fragmentation with different enzymes and chemicals at of the same protein, and try and see what is the pattern of fragmentation appearing in them. And once we have such small fragments, then we can look at the overlap regions, and once we have determined the sequence of appearing of these polypeptides, we can tell the entire protein sequence or reconstruct the sequences by overlapping the smaller fragments to form the entire protein sequence. So, looking at the diagram, so the technique has become very much automated, and it is online with the chromatography system as well. So, you do not need to do elution of each and every N-terminal that is newly generated. So, the automation has been done by Moore and Stein, which also have credited for the automated chromatography, and they have not received a Nobel Prize for this although. So, what kind of samples we can work with for Edmonds? We need around 1 to 50 picomoles of sample, although very pure and homogeneous, and we need 5 to 30 microliters of volatile solvents in which the sample can be dissolved, and it can also be concentrated onto a PVDF membrane, and several buffers are contaminating, so they should not be used. Modified cysteines should be taken care by oxidation or reduction, and if there is any N-terminal blockage or if there is any proline etc. present, that has to be taken care of. And glycosylation and other modifications of the protein of the amino acids will also hinder with the results, may change or reduce the retention time. So, another modification based on the same principle by Edmonds, we have the Sanger's method, and he used the FDNB or 1-fluoro-2,4-dinitrobenzene and diacetyl chlorides, and this is also easily detectable and follows much the same principle as Edmonds. And this is the Sanger's method, where the N terminal is labeled with FDNB, and we can hydrolyze the polypeptide with 6 molar HCl at 110 degrees and then run it on a Dawes column, where retention time and elution profile can be generated, and the data can be compared to the standards, which are the FNB or diacetyl chloride derivatives of the 20 amino acids. So, this is the structure of diacetyl chloride. So, as we were saying, the sequencing has undergone lot of technological advancement. Evolution has occurred from the manual method. Now, we have the automation, and Edmond and Begg have been credited for its development, and solid phase sequencing in 1971 has been developed, where an automated peptide sequencer could use the same chemistry as the Edmonds, but with the sample covalently attached to a solid support, and that minimized the loss when we are eluting the PTH or labeled amino acid. Also, there are gas phase peptide sequenators, and current sequenators have multiple cartridges, so multiple reactions can occur at simultaneously, and what we imagine to take a lot of time can give you a sequence within a day. So, we will look at techniques which are definitely a betterment and over this basic principle of sequencing in our subsequent lectures. Introduction to proteins, mass spectrometry, protein sequencing. In our lectures before, we had talked about how we can determine the primary sequence of a protein, and we were discussing how the basic principle of all protein sequencing is the Edmonds degradation process, in which we were tediously labeling each of the amino acid once it was arriving at the N terminal, and there was cleavage of the labeled amino acids, its elution in the chromatography, and its identification. So, coming and moving on from that technology, we have mass spectrometry, which can be used to determine the primary sequence of the protein. And we can do a peptide mass fingerprinting. So, the very basic very basic experiment we can design using mass spectrometry is peptide mass fingerprinting. In this, we obtain the proteolytically fragmented peptides and we compare the masses in the database and predict what will be the masses that would arise from digestion of certain known molecules. So, here the protein is broken into several fragments by proteolytic enzymes. Generally, we said the tryptic digested fragments are available in the databases. The resulting fragments are extracted using acetonitrile and then dried by vacuum, and then they are dissolved and inserted into a vacuum chamber of a mass spectrometer such as the ESI-TOF and MALDI-TOF. And the peaks that arise, we can use that and for determining the molecular weight of the peptide and compare it in the SwissProt and GenBank to find the closest matches. There are several softwares which can use to find this kind of information, and however, this step requires a peptide purification or chromatography step, which is a hindering step and makes it a non-throughput technique. So, we do mass spectrometry for various proteins which are not easily amendable for Edmond type of degradation that we had talked about, or sequenators. So, there are several conjugated proteins which are bound to prosthetic groups, metals or hemes or lipids, etc. There are which cannot be used while we are doing Edmonds, because they will block the amino acid and will not allow its cyclization due to steric reasons. Mass spectroscopy spectrometry, on the other hand, is a much more sensitive technique, requires very little time, and it can fragment the peptides in seconds. There is no need for peptides or protein to be perfectly pure or homogeneous. It can use to identify even the blocked or post-translationally modified proteins as well. And this forms the core of technology for the field of proteomics. However, mass spectrometry also has its limitations, that some amino acids which have similar molecular weights can result in dubious results. So, this technique has seen development from the year 1978, when we were talking about Edmond and Begg automating their sequencers, to Koichi Tanaka and John B. Fenn, who are credited with the discovery of mass spectrometry. So, they had developed the methods for identification and structure analysis of biomolecules. And this Nobel Prize is shared for another technique, which is solution NMR for proteins, to Kurt Wuthrich. And this Nobel Prize in itself suggests that you can look into the three-dimensional structure of a protein using NMR, and you can also look into the primary structure of the protein using the mass spectrometry. So, in a sense, this Nobel Prize defines how you can study protein structures to greatest resolution. So, protein sequencing has two ways of going about it. We can use the classical methods of Edman degradation and Senger's method we had discussed in our previous lecture, where we had successive rounds of N-terminal modification cleavage of the amino acid labeled with the dye and its identification. And now we have mass spectrometry, and mostly we use MALDI MS or ESI MS, which can precisely identify the mass of a peptide, and also we will see how we can derive the amino acid sequence in subsequent lectures. So, it also can be used to determine the post-translational modifications that occur in the protein. And definitely for determining the protein sequencing, we can use bioinformatic tools to compare the sequences available of the novel protein to the database and find its match for function and structure. So, what is the starting material for doing a mass spectrometry experiment? Here also we look at, we start off with the peptides. We need to take the protein and fragment it, and these are then used in a chromatography and fed into a mass spectrometer. So, how we need proteins, we need peptides and not proteins, because proteins will have issues of solubility and they have areas of hydrophobicity, etc. And if we fragment them to smaller peptides, most of these issues are resolved. Most of the hydrophobicity, etc. is lost and it becomes a more homogeneous sample. And the sensitivity of the mass spectrometer for proteins is much lower because there is more noise. And many times proteins, while they are processed, may result in numerous isoforms which can complicate the results. So, peptides up to the 20 residues long are best for mass spectroscopy. However, with the development of technique, we have the top down protein sequencing, where we can take the entire protein and sequence it. So, we have spoken about mass spectrometry. So, what is the principle of this technique? The mass spectrometry consists of an ion source, a mass analyzer that measures the mass to charge ratio, or M/Z, of the ionized analytes, and there is a detector that registers the number of ions of each M/Z value. The electron ionization, which is production of gas phase ions of the compound or peptide of interest, this ion will undergo further fragmentation, and each primary product ion derived from the molecular ion, once it is fragmentation, will further undergo fragmentation, and they are then separated in the mass spectrometer according to their mass to charge ratio, and they are detected in proportion to their abundance. So, the data or the graph that you will see, the spectrum will display a plot of the ion abundance versus the mass M/Z ratio. The ions will provide information concerning the nature and structure of the precursor molecule. In the spectrum of a pure compound, the molecular ion, if present, will have the highest value of M/Z, followed by ions which are going to contain heavier isotopes, and we can add them up to give the molecular mass of the compound. So, mass spectrometry has three very important components, and they are shown here. So, you have an ion source which will produce the gaseous ions. There is an analyzer which will resolve the ions depending on their mass M/Z ratio, and the charged particles, they are accelerated by an external electric field in the mass analyzer, where they are subjected to an external magnetic field also. Now, the interaction will occur of this external magnetic field to the magnetic fields that arise by accelerated electric charges, and under this effect, this will cause them to deflect when they are traveling the analyzer chamber. Once they are deflected, they will be deflected to different extents depending on their mass to charge and depending on the amount of magnetic field that is created by each of them. They will be detected by the detector system, and the deflection, which is also going to be proportional to the m by z, will be detected, and relative abundance of each type of ionic species can be resolved. We can use various samples for mass spectrometry. These days GE-LC-MS can be used, where proteins which are separated just from the SDS page can be taken up in a thin gel slice and taken up by an HPLC, and here the molecular weight already is available with the prior by the prior experiment, and we can here look at even the least abundant proteins or proteins that are present only under certain metabolic states. Another type of MS we can do is the mud pit, in which there is multi-dimensional protein identification technology. Here you first perform a 2D gel electrophoresis on the basis of charge and on hydrophobicity, and then you can take the sample for mass spectrometry. So, the two dimensions of a gel electrophoresis are the isoelectric focusing, which will separate the protein on the basis of its isoelectric point, and the second is the second dimension of the gel electrophoresis is the SDS polyacrylamide gel, which will separate it according to its molecular weight. So, how does the sample taken up in a mass spectrometer? So, the peptides after protein digestion are injected into a very small, so a micro scale capillary high HPLC column. This is a very small column of a very low diameter, around 50 to 150 micrometers only, and this way the peptides are eluted in a very small volume using a solvent gradient of increasing organic content. So, firstly the peptide which will emerge will be in order of their hydrophobicity, and many times very extensively hydrophobic peptides may even be retained in the column. So, there are several ionization methods, and we can call them as the hard or the soft methods. So, there is first the electron impact, which is used for very small molecules of 1 to 1000 Daltons only, and proteins do not lie in that range. Then we have fast atom bombardment, which is a semi-hard method which you can use for peptides, sugars up to a 6 kilodalton size. Then there is electrospray ionization, which is a soft technique, and it is routinely used for peptides, proteins up to 200 kilodaltons. And there is MALDI, which is matrix assisted laser desorption, which is also a soft ionization technique and can be used up for DNA and protein up to 500 kilodalton. So, there are different applications for different ionization. So, you can have a combination of an ionizer, analyzer and detector depending on your protein sample and depending on what analysis you are trying to do. So, in the soft ionization, for which the 2002 Nobel Prize was also given, was for soft ionization, in which molecule or the protein will remain entirely intact. It was first conceived in the 1960s by Malcolm Dole, but it was John Fenn who later put it to use for doing protein structures or peptide structures, and also went on to receive the Nobel Prize. While MALDI was introduced in 1985 by Franz Hillenkamp and Michael Carus, and these two techniques can be coupled in different permutations and form mass with the analyzers. So, a brief comparison of the ionizers. You have the ESI, electrospray ionization, which ionizes the analytes out of a solution, and it is normally coupled to a HPLC or a liquid chromatography column, and this looks like well, So, in this electrospray, the analyte is dissolved into a volatile solvent, methanol or acetonitrile, which will rapidly evaporate, and the sample is passed through a very fine stainless steel capillary at a very slow flow rate into the ion source. A very high voltage of 3 to 4 kilovolts is applied onto the capillary, hence it is positively charged, and so is the analyte present in it. Now, the solvent, the liquid or the protein also becomes positively charged. These high fields lead to the emergence of the sample as a charged aerosol spray, and these micro drops will have very low electrostatic repulsions because the charge density is right now dispersed. But once it is emerged into the chamber, these will subsequently result in evaporation of the methanol, etc., and aerosolization will take place with the coming in gas such as nitrogen, and now this will move the aerosol towards the mass analyzer. But while it is going towards the mass analyzer, these micro drops, which are charged positively, will become smaller and smaller in size due to evaporation of the solvent, and the positive charge density will increase, and now repulsions will take place, and these repulsions will cause the droplets to explode and in series of steps, and you will have ultimately only the analyte hanging in the vacuum chamber, which is devoid of any solvent whatsoever. So, this soft method will produce analytes that are not cleaved. So, fragments of peptides will not be cleaved, but they will be positively charged, and you will have a Gaussian distribution of positive charge which will occur on a chain. So, each chain may have a different positive charge, and depending on the basic residues you will have the same chain but with a different charge. So, M by Z ratio here is changing. Mass of the peptide may remain same, but the extent of charge it is gaining will change, and it will then be detected at the detector. So, during the electrospray ionization process, tryptic peptides usually become protonated, and they get a H+2 charge, where M is the mass of the peptide and H+ is the hydrogen ion. So, you will have the measure of M by Z value for a peptide. If you are starting off with the M1200 peptide, it will be seen as a 600 in the spectrum because it has gained a charge. So, peptides can also have higher charges if there are more than 15 amino acid longs, and if they are containing more basic amino acids such as histidine, which can also be protonated. While we are doing MALDI ionization, and this is how MALDI would look like. In MALDI there is matrix assisted laser desorption or ionization. Here you will have sublimation, and ionization is occurring at the sample which has been fixed onto a matrix, and it is normally used to analyze relatively simple peptide mixtures. The laser used here is a UV laser. The sample is mixed with a UV absorbent matrix. Usually you will have 4-hydroxycinnamic acid for peptides, and this laser will be compatible to the absorption maxima of this absorbent matrix, so that once the laser light is falling onto the matrix, it will absorb the radiation and it will transfer to the nearest peptide, and this way the dissociation of matrix will occur, where phase changes to the supercompressed gas and charge transfer to the analyte molecule will occur. So, expansion of the matrix will occur at supersonic velocity, and analyte trapped in the matrix will explode, further leading to aerosolization, and this can be coupled to a time of flight mass spectrometer. It is not an online mode. You have to prepare your sample and load it onto the matrix and apply it onto the matrix, and it cannot be, definitely it is not taking a HPLC input. This technique, however, have some reproducibility issues, but these are routinely used for ionization. So, this is what peptide which has gained a charge look like, and it will appear onto a spectrum of a MS. Now, the second component we talked about is the mass analyzer, and mass analyzer is the crux or the key to resolution and sensitivity of the technique, and it is very important that it is able to gauge the mass accurately and generate information spectra from the peptide fragments. We will discuss about peptide fragments in the tandem mass spectroscopy spectrometry, and there are four types of mass analyzers that are used for proteomic research. We have discussed, we will be discussing time of flight and quadruple mass spectrometers. The other two are quadruple ion traps and Fourier transform ion cyclotron resonance mass spectrometer devices. So, these can be used standalone. So, you can have one ionizer followed by one analyzer, and this analyzer can be followed by a second analyzer depending on the strength of each analyzer. So, we can couple them in tandem and use the property of one for distributing the ions, and then use the property of second for further segregation. This way we are able to have a better resolution. So, definitely the ion traps and FT ICR techniques are now the newest ones, but routinely most cheaply used, cheap in the terms of cost of running and purchase and instrument cost, are the time of flight and quadruple mass. So, these are the four types of analyzers, and we can see the mass analyzer is the center, the heart of the technique. So, you can have a time of flight where the sample travels through a tunnel, and depending on the kinetic velocity it deflects and it is detected by the detector. Then you can have a tandem. So, you can have a TOF which is followed by a further TOF. This way detection, the resolution increases. Then you can have a quadruple which can be in a linear setup, and then you can have quadruple coupled to a time of flight, and then you can also have ion traps and then Fourier transform ion cyclotron resonance MS systems. So, there can be several combinations of them. So, now talking about two of the analyzers, we are here looking at TOF and quadruple ion traps. So, in the TOF it is a time of flight, and this is the time that it takes for the ion to travel through an electric field free flight tube. So, there is no interfering field. In quadruple there is going to be an interfering magnetic field. Here there is a tube which is not charged. So, this is the tube through which the peptide ion will travel, and all the sources, all the ion source will cause the ion to be accelerated. So, once it is accelerating, there is kinetic energy which is dependent also on the mass and on the velocity. So, depending on the mass of the peptide and its velocity, they will travel at different speeds. So, the lighter ones will fly faster and heavier ones will remain will reach the detector late. And quadruple ion traps. So, this is how an ideal experiment will look like, and we will discuss how we have to prepare the sample and give the sample for ionization and analysis. This also tells us about, we have studied for mass spectroscopy that there are several quadruple, time of flight and ion trap and FT type of analyzers, which all can be used to resolve the mass by charge ratio type of ions. So, compiling this lecture, we will now in subsequent lectures discuss about proteomic experiments and talk further about the technique of mass spectroscopy. Thank you.